Alexi asked this question asking about adjuncts. Did any of your sources discuss issues with adjuncts in beers themselves, like lactose, as barriers of entry to establishments or beverage experiences? This would be specific to vegans.
Right. I think that that is a great question, and it's one that does come up a lot. I know at Pilot specifically, they have a cafe latte milk stout that has lactose in it. So they have on their menu, this is not vegan. They will make sure to tell people that. And I think that the use of isinglass or gelatin finings in beer can be an issue for some people, and that needs to be respected. So that's, even as a vegetarian, those are conversations I have to have at like holiday dinners, like, hey, don't use chicken broth in the mashed potatoes. I need to be able to eat those. And that education for brewers, that like it those are very real concerns for people that will define, in a very physical way, whether they have a good or bad experience at your brewery. So it came up in the course of, Pilot, when they're planning a vegan dinner. They make sure that they're not at all going to use something that has lactose in it. And they're very anti-hazy IPA, so it's only going to be their milk stout that has lactose in it. But yeah, that is a real concern, and one that I would love to see more education out there for customers, so they know to ask whether something, again, like something like a New England IPA, it's very common for it to have lactose in it. It's not common for that to be listed on the menu. I would love to see more customer education on what kinds of non-vegan adjuncts you may run into in beer.
Kate, Mark, Yuri, Holly, anybody else have a question that you might want to chime in with for Jen? Kate had a question.
Really more of a comment.
let's run with it. Kate,
I'm the worst.
go ahead for sake of recording. If you want to maybe just ask out loud what you're curious about in terms of adding to the conversation.
Oh, this was really just a comment about the vegan, about like vegan fining agents other than gelatin or isinglass. Newspeg. And like, I was surprised by the number of comments to the TTB during this public comment period, which has been brought about by President Biden's executive order promoting competition in the alcohol industry, mentioning how many producers in the US would like to use vegan fining agents that I suppose are not approved by the TTB at this point, but are approved in other countries. It came up like several times in the comments, which I thought was really interesting. Yeah, anyway, that's my
that is interesting. Was it like carrageenan?
Yes, and which I had never heard of before, and pea protein.
Okay. I've never heard of pea. So there are clarifying agents, like Whirlfloc, Irish moss, those things you can use. And really, like, using gelatin or isinglass is such a clunky process to do that a lot of places, like even some place like Guinness, who popularized isinglass, a lot of places don't use it anymore because it's kind of like you have a pet for a little while until you're able to use it. And there's just better fining agents, or I should say better, there's different, more efficient fining agents available now. But yeah, the pea protein is really interesting. I'll have to look into that.
Jen,
it was news to me.
Yeah.
for our own education, could you repeat the first one that you said and tell us what that is?
Yeah, it's carrageenan. So it's CARRAGENAN, I believe. I want to say it is derived from seaweed, and I know that it is in the I know within like the very vague wellness sphere. The use of carrageenan is debated on whether, should you be ingesting products that have that or not. But I'm almost positive it's a seaweed derivative.
Thank you. That was an excellent, sorry for the on the spot, but I'm fascinated with stuff like that. So make a note, everybody, if you're watching now or later, for that one as it comes up. Kate, thanks a bunch for that. That's a really good point. Jen, amongst these things, because we're talking language and new words, I do want to ask you about some of the exploration that you've done in terms of sensory descriptions. And I think you kind of foreshadowed it a little bit when we first started our conversation, because I think this has a lot of applications, both in terms of what it happens within the industry and the way that businesses may approach it, but especially for us as writers and the way that we think about language literally every day. What is some of the work that you've been thinking about or exploring when it comes to inclusive sensory language when we're talking about beer and food?
So, it's one very relevant one I can use that I hadn't ever really thought about until one of my friends asked me about it, is the use of meaty as as a sensory term when it comes to beer. If you're talking about something that has, you don't run into it very often, but if something has an umami note, a lot of times it'll be described as meaty or brothy, something like that. And again, that's one of those descriptors that I've read, and in my mind it's like, okay, meaty, I think I know what that is. And I hadn't really thought about it until one of my friends was like, doesn't that seem kind of lazy? And like, what about people like us who don't eat meat? We just have an idea. And one of the things that I'm a big proponent of in terms of making sensory accessible and empowering people to describe beer is, a lot of times we have access to what those ingredients are. Something is stone fruit, like you can go get a peach. If something's palm, you can get an apple or a pear. You can taste those things. If it's meaty, like, I'm not, even for the sake, as much as I love beer, I'm not going to go just like get meat and and chew on it to be able to like make that memory. So the one of the biggest things I'm seeing that I would love to push forward is, again, thinking about who writes the style guidelines, who has come up with these descriptors, and what are we leaving out? It's kind of like how I can't think of, everybody knows one of the analogies of whatever language has this many words for this one thing. There are all sorts of, again, this it's very westernized language that the beer uses, also that wine uses. Beer is a little bit more egalitarian in terms of, kind of its background and the people who are in it. So it's somewhat more approachable than something like wine. But who decided? Who said that these are the descriptors that we're using? And even something like Draft Lab, which I love. I mean, I've got the Draft Lab sensory maps behind me. Even those, when they were developing them, who were they sent to? Who were the people who were being asked to, taste these beers and evaluate and provide descriptions for? And it's a very, very narrow slice of the population. And that's not the population where there's a ton of opportunity for growth in terms of getting more people enthusiastic and involved in beer. So again, like, how do we decenter sensory language and bring in descriptions that may be far more accurate? Can we get closer than meaty or brothy? Is there some perfect descriptor out there in a different language in somebody else's lived experience that would, make it like that's exactly what it is? So I think that's really a huge frontier that's out there for sensory language and beer styles and beer descriptions, is whose experiences are we drawing from to make these?
How do you do that personally? How do you try to find new ways to talk about beer or food and use language that you aren't familiar with?
So one of the things that I do, and this is also as just my philosophy as a beer judge, oftentimes, particularly outside of something like GABF, where I'm still very much like a little fish, at most judging tables, I am the most experienced judge. And a big part of my philosophy is I will rarely tell the person I'm judging with what I perceive. I will ask them and, have them tell me, and work with them on, yes, so, what you're describing right now, that's Brettanomyces, or, that's going to come from the malt, but really empowering them to use their own experience, their own palate to describe something, and then saying, okay, this is great. You have like, I get what you're saying. And, now we can kind of reverse engineer that into a commonly accepted lexicon. So the example I always use is with Belgian yeast. When I was first developing my palate, when I would smell a beer that had Belgian yeast in it, I would think of my grandma's root cellar. And, unless you've been in Taney County, Missouri in the Ozark Mountains in my grandmother's root cellar, you don't have any idea of what that is. That language is evocative, but it doesn't really communicate anything. And then learning that, okay, that's the thing that immediately comes to mind. And what is it within that memory that, I can use to describe? So I can say this is damp earth, it's somewhat musty, and, taking that experience and then turning that into the lexicon that I can write that down on a score sheet, or I can give that as feedback. And that is still evocative, but it's also, conveying information. And that's a big part of developing your palate is, okay, what is the thing that popped in your head, and let's talk about it. And, let's talk about those kinds of experiences. And one other example I can share of when I was training a sensory panel, somebody said, this is, I get pear esters, but I very specifically get Asian pear. And that, that's something that I haven't been exposed to Asian pear, but the next time I saw one at the grocery store, I bought one and tried it. And, then was like, okay, now I have this memory for Asian pear.
I think it's really interesting the way that you described your process there, because in my head, what I was hearing, you just described the way a good interview works. And it's really because, and you were saying about how, early on when you're kind of, maybe getting more comfortable in asking specific questions, but what you did as you were just describing, I don't know if anybody else caught this, or maybe my brain's just turned on to journalist 110% right now. But you're describing, you're talking to someone, you ask them an open-ended question, you're trying to pull some of their emotional and kind of like their immediate physical thoughts out of that, which then sends the conversation into any direction possible. You're not guiding them necessarily to a specific answer. You're pulling out of them something that could take you in, left, right, forward, backward, in anywhere. And so it sounds like when you're doing that, and maybe something for us to think about too, when we're thinking about food and beer and interacting with the people who make them, that thinking about flavor and the way we talk about flavor can exist in the same way we think about the process of asking questions, about letting them lead things in a way that maybe we didn't think about before. I want to talk to you. Maybe I'm going to maybe go for like another 5-10 minutes or so, because you just judged GABF and I would love to hear about that. But before I do, if anybody else has a question that you'd like to ask of Jen, I will pause. If you want to throw something in the chat box or unmute yourself and ask away, you are more than welcome. Okay. So it was just last week you were judging at GABF. One of the things, so I have friends, we have peers who I've talked to a little bit about doing that before, but maybe for people who don't know what that means exactly, could you just kind of give a behind the scenes explanation of what it is when you're a judge for something that big?
Yeah, so this is my second year with judging with GABF, and It's funny because the last 2 years I've done it, I haven't had like a normal GABF judging experience. So it's been in the BA's warehouse in Louisville, Colorado, which is like halfway between Denver and Boulder and in the middle of nowhere. But the process to be able to be a GABF judge is typically the wait list is about, I think it's about 3 years. I was on the list for about a year. And you know, when you apply, you have to have 3 references. They should be from other GABF judges, master cicerones, you know, master, grandmaster, BJCP judges. Like it can't be, you know, like your friend or like your old boss or somebody, I guess, unless they fit into one of those descriptions. And, you know, they have to write a recommendation. You have to submit a resume. You have to list like, here is my sensory experience. Here's my judging experience. And I have since served as a reference for a few people wanting to become GABF judges. And you really, the most important thing, they want you to have a good palate, obviously, but you need to be able to judge fast and you need to be able to play nice. And those are really the 2 main things that they want to make sure that, you know, that you're able to do. And it's kind of a curious thing within beer judging. I have rarely dug in about a score or beer, you know, as in life, most people agree about most things. If something is flawed, and you know, you have that training, you know, if a beer has diacetyl, it has diacetyl in it. And if it's a flaw, it's a flaw. And that's really it. And what you don't want is, you know, somebody who just says, no, this is my score, I'm not budging, you're wrong. And you know, really that's only happened to me. There's only one time in my judging career that happened, with a judge who had judged 2 competitions, and so he was an expert. And that's, you know, that's really the only time something like that has happened. And again, as my philosophy as a judge of, you know, most of the time, most beers are fine. And you're not arguing over whether something should be a medal winner or not. You know, it's also kind of in that gray area once you get into those final of like, okay, well, what's going to be gold, silver, bronze? And a couple of times last week in medal rounds that came up where, you know, maybe we could agree on the top 4 beers, but half the table thought this beer should be kicked out. The other half said, no, this is one of my top beers. And, you know, in those cases with veteran judges, it was like, let's just get fresh pours of all 4. Well, I'll just take a minute and, you know, and revisit and decide if we really feel that strongly. And most of the time you don't. So really being able to judge quickly, being able to be respectful of your fellow judges are big things. And, you know, and not to question the judgment of anybody who selects judges for GABF, but for a very long time there, you know, BJCP has been around since the mid 80s. Cicerone's only been around for a little over 10 years. And so there are a few judges that were, you know, people who opened breweries like in the mid 2000s when there wasn't a pool of, you know, qualified, they've gone through these certification program judges. There are people who got a small business loan or could cash in their 401k or, you know, or whatever, who brew beer and have brewed beer, but don't necessarily have a ton of judging experience, except for the fact that they were around when GABF needed more judges. And you definitely run into those each year. Again, not at all to say that they're unqualified, but you can tell the difference between beer judges and people who judge beer sometimes.
Maybe not so much on the potential drama behind the scenes, but I just do want to highlight that like there's like a nugget of a story idea there. I'm really interested in the judging quickly and being nice as like the 2 tenets to being a successful judge. What does that mean exactly? Like when you say you have to judge quickly, which I think also means drink quickly or taste quickly, perhaps is another way to
Right.
say it. What does that mean for those two things?
So when your typical round, you will have, depending on the number of entries, each category will have between 3 to 4 rounds. And when it's a very large category, so something like a hazy, juicy IPA, um, that will, those like first round, second rounds will be spread out over a lot of tables. For each flight, for a first round, you won't have more than 12 beers, but you would expect around 10. I would say 10 is probably about average, and you have an hour to taste through each one of the beers, fill out score sheets, discuss with your, whoever you're judging with, which 3 beers you would like to move forward. In the first round, you don't do first, second, third. It's just these are the best. These are the ones we think have the best chance of going to the end. And that is so, and then you're typically leaving about 10 to 15 minutes for talking with your fellow judge about which beers you'd like to kick out, which beers you would like to keep. So really you're looking at about 45 minutes to go through 10 beers and fill out a score sheet for it, giving as much feedback as you can. For something like a professional competition, I typically give less feedback. I'll do more of a sensory, but also still keeping it very high level. If it's something like a homebrew competition, there's a lot more, here's what I'm tasting, here's where you may want to tweak your process. Because with homebrew competitions, sometimes people don't enter just to win. They enter because they want feedback. They're trying to perfect that recipe, or they know that something's not quite right, and nobody, like if you're asking them face to face, everyone just says, yeah, no, this is good. And in a professional competition, people are entering it because they think this is the best version of their best beer. So it's generally just a little bit quicker of a sensory description. So maybe 1 or 2 lines of writing. So that's the judging quickly. I was out there also for the National Homebrew Competition, judging that back in April, and they actually had an egg timer that your steward would come and put on your table and like zit and set it down to help keep everybody on track. And then being a respectful judge means that the beers that are your top beers aren't always going to be the beers that move forward, and listening to what other judges have to say, and taking in that feedback, and really not getting personally invested in the beers that these are the best beers, and if you don't like these same beers, then you're wrong. Generally speaking, there aren't a ton of instances where people are going to have a beer that's very flawed, right, and say, no, this is absolutely a gold. So it's really just being respectful, listening to other people. I've judged with a lot of old homebrew dudes who will be like, no, that's not what you're tasting. You're tasting this and this. And that's the kind of decorum and behavior that they absolutely don't want someplace like GABF.
I'm going to ask this last question here, because I feel like what you just shared between those two things might help set somebody up in terms of it. I don't know if I've read a lot of stories, to be honest, about the behind the scenes and logistics as it relates to judging competitions. We always read and hear stories about places that have won medals for beers, but not what happens behind the scenes. So maybe we've given people some idea for a story. Let's give them some sources. You said you got the chance to judge with some of your mentors. Who do you feel like you've learned the most from and have helped guide you when you talk about judging and tasting?
So this past week, one of my judge captains was Lindsay Barr, who created Draft Lab, or was one of the co-creators. And she is definitely like my life goals. And we're actually presenting together at the Craft Malt Conference in February on malt sensory and how to talk to customers about your malt. And I have like a handful of friends who get a text from me every single time Lindsay and I have a call, like a planning call, where I'm like, Lindsay Barr and I are going to present together. I know I've already told you, but I'm just going to tell you again. So I had the opportunity to be a judge at her table last week. And that was a really great experience because, again, Lindsay is a beer judge. You know, she was the head of New Belgium Sensory for several years and runs a very organized table with a very sensory mindset, and spent time, and I haven't seen other judges do this before, judge captains do this before, where after we read through the category we were going to be judging, she said, why did everybody pick this category? What do you like about this beer? What do you like when you're looking for this beer? And really kind of putting everybody at ease and, getting everyone talking to each other. And I haven't been at a table where a judge has done that. So that was something that I was like, okay, filing away in my file of how can I be exactly like Lindsay Barr? I will remember this for the future, that this was a really great way to break the ice and get people talking to each other.
Well, Jen, thank you so much. I'm just right before we go, I'm just going to bring this up again, just so everyone see. This is the story that we were talking about at the beginning of the chat as part of our Diversity in Beer Writing Grant Series. And thank you so much also for sharing your experience and expertise on all things food and judging as well. Really appreciate it. Thanks everybody for joining. Jen, we look forward to hopefully having an excuse to talk again.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, everyone.
Be well, everybody. Take care.
Yeah.